In 1877, Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky, already a highly regarded composer and teacher at the Moscow Conservatory, made one of the greatest mistakes of his life. He married. His bride was one of his former pupils at the conservatory, a naive young woman who either didn't understand Tchaikovsky when he attempted to explain his homosexuality to her in the guarded, prudish language that the manners and customs of the time would permit, or simply didn't care. The marriage no doubt reflected the composer's desire to please his 81-year-old father, who was passionate about the idea of marriage and family, as well as his concern that his forbidden predilections would be found out. It was a spectacular failure, and the composer fled, his life in tatters. To complicate this picture, Tchaikovsky had, some months earlier, acquired a benefactress, Nadezhda von Meck, who had begun providing the composer with a modest stipend that made a degree of independence possible, and he had begun work on a symphony dedicated to her. It was during this creative process that he made his big mistake, and in the aftermath of that mistake, he finished the work. Tchaikovsky's personal upheaval is writ large in this symphony, which is autobiographical almost to the point of being programmatic. In fact, Tchaikovsky provided a program of sorts at Madame von Meck's insistence, and I will make reference to it as the movements unfold, as I believe it sheds some useful light on this large, difficult, and very unusual composition. As you listen to it, you should probably keep his circumstances in mind. In this music, a 37-year-old Tchaikovsky was bearing his soul both to whatever audience it might enjoy and, above all, to a woman he'd never met, but with whom he led a long and sustained correspondence that enriched and, to a large degree, shaped his life. The Tchaikovsky Fourth is a minor key symphony that ends in the parallel major. That's also a general description of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, written almost 7 decades earlier, a symphony that provided Tchaikovsky with a useful model. The latter's use of a powerful unison motive at the symphony's opening, which returns at intervals to demark the first movement's sections and in some sense permeates the whole work, is almost certainly a nod to that earlier symphony. The overall proportions have changed considerably, however. In the Beethoven model, the work's center of gravity has moved to the final movement. In Tchaikovsky's symphony, that center has moved back to movement 1, as in earlier models than Beethoven's. In fact, the opening movement is, in the words of Franz Keller, one of the most towering symphonic structures in our whole literature. From an overall perspective, the symphony's tonal plan seems simple and traditional, with an opening movement in F minor, a slow movement in the darker minor subdominant key, and third and fourth movements in the parallel major. A close movement-by-movement examination, however, turns up a key scheme that is extraordinarily sophisticated. By all means, focus on this dimension of the work as you follow my running commentary. It really sets this symphony apart from more traditional works in the same form. The recording in this video is by the Leningrad Philharmonic under the baton of Yevgeny Mravinsky. There are days when I find myself thinking that the Leningrad Phil on Mravinsky's watch must have been the finest orchestra the world has ever heard. The opening movement is a vast, sprawling F minor essay in sonata form, whose stern opening motto, meant to represent fate, returns at intervals to demark sections of the movement and incite the upheavals. In this opening statement, we'll hear the music torn between F minor and E major, an absolutely thrilling juxtaposition of key centers. When the opening music nears its end, the clarinets and bassoons take over from the horns and reel out a reiterated falling 2-note motive, scale degrees 6 and 5 of F minor. Keep it in mind, that distinctive melodic sigh, often under extreme rhythmic compression and turned into something forceful and insistent, comes back from time to time to initiate recurrences of theme 1, whose initial melodic interval is that very motive, much as it sets it up in the first place. The first theme is a vast one, a sad 9/8 time waltz riddled with hemiolas and nudged along by a quiet, restless accompaniment. taking a rondo-like shape and lasting well over 2 minutes. I don't know anything else quite like it in the standard repertoire, although the corresponding theme of Brahms's First Symphony, whose score appeared in print the same year, comes close, as does that of the Mahler Sixth, which arrived 3 decades later. When that theme finally reaches its conclusion, the transition, which provides a marked contrast to what has come before, conveys the music to the relative major key, as we might expect. Some darkening chromaticism eventually creeps in, however, and theme 2 thus begins in A-flat minor. Let me make a comment about the solo forces used during the transition that got us to this point. The conversational exchange between the first clarinet and first bassoon, whose voices lie an octave apart, suggests a gender differentiation much remarked on by commentators, and probably should be held in mind. Tchaikovsky's Fourth is a work often critiqued in feminist terms, and I think there's some validity to that approach. Theme 2 begins with a teasing, coquettish tune in the first clarinet, whose continuation includes some little wilting figures in demi-semiquavers supplied by various woodwinds. A variant of these figures will return during the reprise of the primary theme of Movement 2, providing a narrative link between those two movements. The theme's harmonic trajectory eventually leads to B major, and the exposition ends there, a tritone from where it began, with a splendid 2-part closing theme whose first part sounds like a triumphal apotheosis of theme 2, but whose second part has a forced and manic quality, like that of a coerced celebration. This section is, for me, one of the most telling in the entire work. I also find it telling that part 1 of the closing theme, the triumphal sounding part, does not return during the recapitulation, for there is no triumph there to celebrate. The fate motive, the symphony's motto that opened the movement, now charges in to inaugurate the development, which gives an exhaustive account of theme 1, and whose third section is made of music of almost unbearable yearning, and whose feverish crescendo explodes in a threefold iteration of that baleful fate motive, each more terrifying than the last, each sending the panic-stricken music thrashing and reeling and spiraling out of control. It is an orchestral upheaval that could almost be described as shocking. The development's final throes propel the music directly into the recapitulation, which begins in D minor with a cruelly truncated statement of the first theme, screamed fortissimo but reduced from its earlier 2+ minutes to almost nothing, collapsing in the short term as if mortally wounded. The transition, too, is reduced to a husk of its former self and makes no modulation. What's happening here is a simple but brilliant tonal strategy, for by bringing back theme 2 in its entirety in D minor and letting it follow an analogous course to the one it traced earlier, the music quite naturally ends up in F major and has thus found its way home. The remainder of the movement unfolds logically and ends in utter despair. I want now to share with you part of the program that Tchaikovsky supplied at Madame von Meck's request, the part that describes Movement 1. The introduction is the kernel, the quintessence, the chief thought of the whole symphony. This is fate, the fatal power which hinders one in the pursuit of happiness from gaining the goal, which jealously provides that peace and comfort do not prevail, that the sky is not free from clouds, a might that swings like the sword of Damocles constantly over the head, that poisons continually the soul. This might is overpowering and invincible. There is nothing to do but submit and vainly to complain. The feeling of desperation and loneliness grows stronger and stronger. Would it not be better to turn away from reality and lull oneself in dreams? Oh, joy! A sweet and tender dream enfolds me. A serene and radiant presence leads me on. Deeper and deeper the soul is sunk in dreams. All that was dark and joyless is forgotten. No, these are but dreams. Roughly, we are awakened by fate. Thus we see that life is only an everlasting alternation of somber reality and fugitive dreams of happiness. Something like this is the program of the first movement. At almost 19 minutes in length, the first movement has lasted nearly as long as the remaining three combined. The second movement, set in the symphony's subdominant key, is a kind of interlude in ABA form. Its A theme, begun by the first oboe, is a sad little tune that winds graciously through its course and unfolds colorfully and in a basically uncomplicated way. The middle section of this movement is optimistic sounding and could be considered a transformation of the opening movement's sad waltz. The movement's climax, which is quite wonderful, will be heard in this section. The return to the opening theme is a return to a sorrowful state of mind, and the movement ends in deepest gloom. Here is what the composer communicated to his benefactress. The second movement of the symphony expresses another aspect of sadness. This is that melancholy feeling which comes in the evening when, weary from one's toil, one sits alone with a book, but it falls from the hand. There come a whole host of memories. It is sad that so much is now in the past, albeit pleasant to recall one's youth, both regretting the past and yet not wishing to begin life over again. Life is wearisome. It is pleasant to rest and look around. Memories abound. Happy moments when the young blood boiled and life was satisfying. There are also painful memories, irreconcilable losses. All this is now somewhere far distant. It is both sad yet somehow sweet to be immersed in the past. The shape of movement 3 is similar to that of the preceding movement, but its character is completely different, although the pizzicato main theme could be considered a further transformation of music that has come before. This movement is an F major scherzo whose primary theme is played by the strings alone and entirely with their fingertips. When that section reaches its conclusion, the first oboe bursts in with a high A and unfolds a cocky, humorous, somewhat inebriated sounding tune shared by other woodwinds, while the string players give their bleeding, throbbing fingertips a breather. The second part of this central section is a military march played by the brasses and based on the pizzicato theme in rhythmic augmentation, which, logically enough, brings the return of that theme for a complete written-out da capo reprise. The coda brings back all the thematic material for a final review, and the movement ends artfully. In Tchaikovsky's words, the third movement expresses no specific feeling. These are whimsical arabesques, vague images that can sweep past the imagination after drinking a little wine and feeling the first phases of intoxication. The spirit is neither cheerful nor sad, thinking about nothing in particular, giving free rein to the imagination, which somehow begins to paint strange pictures. Amid these memories there suddenly comes a picture of drunken peasants and a street song. Then, somewhere in the distance, a military procession passes. These are completely incoherent images which sweep through the head as one falls asleep. They have nothing in common with reality. They are strange, wild, and incoherent. Tchaikovsky appears to have adopted sonata rondo form as the template for his final movement, but it is a most unusual specimen, and my interpretation is open to question. It's basically an F major celebration, larded with more cymbal crashes per minute than any other work in the standard repertoire, a celebration that repeatedly gets out of hand and has to be reined in by main force. The bold, assertive music that opens the movement alternates with some regularity with a sad little minor key Russian folk tune, "In the Fields Stood a Birch Tree," used first as a kind of stern warning and later as the basis for a set of variations. The development is one long crescendo, and at its climax, the fate motto from Movement 1 comes charging in prosecutorially to shut the whole thing down. That is not Tchaikovsky's final word, however. If you're unfamiliar with this work, I won't spoil the ending for you. Here's what Tchaikovsky had to say about the final movement. "If within yourself you find no reasons for joy, then look at others. Go out among the people, see how they can enjoy themselves, surrendering themselves wholeheartedly to joyful feelings. Picture the festive merriment of ordinary people. Hardly have you managed to forget yourself and to be carried away by the spectacle of the joys of others, then irrepressible fate appears again and reminds you of yourself. But others do not care about you, and they have not noticed that you are solitary and sad. Oh, how they are enjoying themselves! How happy they are that all their feelings are simple and straightforward. Reproach yourself and do not say that everything in this world is sad. Joy is a simple but powerful force. Rejoice in the rejoicing of others. To live is still possible. That, my dear friend, is all I can explain to you about the symphony." Let me echo Tchaikovsky's words. I've said everything I need to say, I think. It's time to experience his final movement. It's going to be quite a ride, so return your seat to the upright position and fasten your safety belt.
Thank you.